first time he saw his name written on someone else's mouth, it was in a grainy photo slipped under his door. A woman asleep, her lips smudged with bright red lipstick, spelling his name. As if someone had kissed the letters into place, the paper smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and detergent. He held the print under the kitchen light, the room too quiet except for the refrigerator's drone, and felt something thin and cold settle in his throat. Before we go any further, I ask you a favor. Like the video, subscribe to my channel, and leave a comment below this video with the time you listened to this story. He kept the second envelope on the kitchen table for a long time, its flap unsealed like a question. The next morning, a third lay beneath his doormat. Each package carried the same small truths: a single printed photograph, a strip of tape dusted with lint, and the scent motel soap, cheap detergent, the sour sweetness of burnt coffee that clung to the paper like an aftertaste. He learned to recognize that smell before he opened the pictures. It became a map between his fingers and a place he'd never been. The women in the photos were never the same woman twice. Different ages, different skin, different shapes of jaw and eyebrow. But their mouths were uniform in a way that made his stomach drop. Lipstick, brilliant and obscene, traced his letters, as if some steady, patient pressure had written his name on flesh. Eyes closed, neck muscles slack. There was a sleep that was not peaceful in the pictures. It was a sleep that had bearings, angles, positions, the way the head lay as if arranged. The rooms in the backgrounds blurred, curtains, bedside lamps, television glow. But the lips were sharp, like carvings. He told himself these were pranks, that someone had a grudge, a taste for the theatrical. Maybe a former lover, maybe a stranger with time and Photoshop skill. He told himself stories and folded them small like paper boats he could float away, but the envelopes kept coming. A week became a spool of images that multiplied his unease rather than explaining it. On the fifth day, he took a handful of prints to Mark, who ran a private sleep lab 2 towns over. Mark had the kind of hands that worked with wires and soft plastic cushions. He smelled of spare coffee and circuit board cleaner. He listened, he said, the way some people listen to an old record for the hidden groove. Mark agreed to run the audio extracted from the clinics, linked to the addresses on the backs of a few photos. There were names there, patient numbers, a stamped clinic logo. Whoever mailed them had been methodical. They sat in Mark's small control room, the walls lined with soundproofing foam that made the room feel like the inside of a mouth. The chair was warm where Mark had been. The console lights winked. He fed the files into the software while the rain drew thin knives across the window. They played the first recording quiet, then louder, watching the waveform like a tide chart. For a long stretch, all they heard was the regular, harmless noise of sleep. Slow breaths, the soft scrape of a throat, the random animal shifts of someone turning, then a spike. A thin, frayed spike that rose like a nail through fabric. The computer showed it as an attack of amplitude. But what they heard was a voice too low to be speech, more a shaping of breath. A shaped exhalation that resolved into something tuneful, then back to hush. When Mark slowed the playback, there it was again. A murmur, syllables folded into the hum of the machines, the texture of someone mouthing a name against pillow foam. The sound clipped and warped, as if the tape used was slipping against an old wheel, but the cadence was there, unmistakable. It matched the angle of the camera stills, matched the pressure marks of the lipstick on each photo. He listened with his hand over his own mouth, feeling foolish and afraid the same way one might feel before telling a secret aloud. Mark frowned, adjusted a gain knob, and said, "It's like a lullaby for what?" "He asked for calling," Mark said, and the word came out thin. They pulled more files. Each one held the same jagged moment, different beds, different machines humming in the background, but always a breath that rearranged into a name. If he hadn't recognized the syllables without being told, he might have denied it. It was the human brain, they agreed, attuned to pattern. But the breath broke in the place that exactly preceded every woman's recorded murmur of his name. The waveform lined up with the photographs like twin negatives. He took the prints home and spread them on his floor. They made an obscene collage, lipstick like flags, faces like constellations. The air in his apartment felt altered. Everyday noises sharpened. The refrigerator's drone took on a tremor when he walked past a mirror. He noticed the micro movements of his mouth in the glass and thought he could see freckles of red that weren't there. He slept differently after that. Naps no longer brought rest. Dreams tasted like thrift store perfume. He woke to traces. Pencils shifted on the nightstand. A page flipped in a notebook. The smell of cigarette smoke stuck along the seam of a sweater. Sometimes, at 3 a.m, he would find a single print tucked under his pillow, though he was careful now, covering his face with both hands before he drifted. He'd tell himself he must be imagining the deliveries. He'd tell himself the world was a noisy place, and he had misheard at the clinic's listed address was a building that looked older than its paperwork. A brick rectangle with windows like tired eyes. It sat near the train yards, where freight trains moaned like distant animals. Inside, the reception smelled of bleach and old tea. The fluorescent lights were too bright, and the staff moved with the precise economy of those who have little to give and less time. He made an excuse to speak with anyone who would meet him. An old nurse agreed to see him in a back office, hands clasped, as if she were holding an object too small to drop. Her name badge had been sanded, so the letters were partial and soft. She looked at the photos and did not flinch. That was more unsettling than an outburst. She only tapped a rhythm on the desk with 2 knotted fingers and said, "We hum." He repeated. She smiled in a way that felt practiced, like she had learned to smile at bad things to make them smaller. names settle better when sung, she said. We learned it long ago. When patients come in frightened, a little tune keeps them breathing. Sometimes the nurses hum each other's names to remember who belongs in which bed. Old habits. Her voice was the color of dust, he pressed. Who records them? She shrugged. Shifts, the night techs, sometimes log noise for study. Equipment's temperamental. It captures whatever is nearest, bells, purring machines, the way the ward breathes. If you've been here long enough, you begin to speak to the quiet. He asked whether they'd ever tried to save the recordings, whether there was an archive. She mentioned a box of cassettes in the clinic's storeroom, behind rusting file cabinets. They're old, she said. We keep them because no one has the heart to throw away voices. That night, the photos felt like accusations. He put them in a drawer and snapped it shut. But even closed, they seemed to press against the wood, as if the images could smell the grain. He dreamt of lipsticked syllables pressing upward through a pillow, until his face was a map of someone else's mouth. He returned with a key and a light. The storeroom smelled. He listened to the cassette until the spool warmed beneath his fingers, and the hiss braided itself into the room's low hum. The tape did not speak plainly. It offered a pattern, soft vowels, clipped consonants, breaths paced like a metronome. When the rhythm rose, the clinic recordings showed a sleeping mouthpart, a murmur spilling name-shaped syllables into the dark. He ran the photos through reverse searches. The results returned nothing public. No profiles, no galleries, only the same domestic edges, worn baseboards, cheap curtains, borrowed light. A metadata slip on one image revealed an intake form and an appointment at the small sleep clinic on the edge of town. The clinic sat in beige brick, attempting to look like a house. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and lemon polish. Panels of light hummed overhead with a thin consonant that pricked at his teeth. Reception moved with the smoothness of glossed plastic. Staff smiles slid like glass. He was told records were private and appointments were booked. He returned at dusk, saying he had a friend in neurology. A nurse with papery hands showed him a corridor that smelled of laundry and stale coffee. On the wall hung photocopied studies, non-invasive somnoloquy modulation, comfort, humming, and REM stability. The language was clinical, careful, precise. Her thumb rubbed the cuff of her sleeve. He asked about humming. She said they hummed at night to soothe patients. It had started as a ritual, a small kindness when staff were few and lullabies beat sedatives for cost. Names, she admitted, had a particular force. You hum a name, and a sleeper can drift toward that cadence. Memory deepens around a syllable. People recorded loops to keep nights steady. Sometimes, she said, they say names back. The sentence hung. He asked what that meant. Her eyes shifted like an animal's. In the morning, some patients wake murmuring a name not their own, she said. A neighbor's. A tape's. The thing they needed to hear. She unlocked a metal drawer in the nurse's station, as if relieving herself of a long burden. Inside lay cassettes, labeled in tired ink: Ward B. Humone, Night Loop, Comfort 4/3. At the bottom was a cassette with no label, its adhesive flaking. When he lifted it, his palm caught the faint perfume of motel soap and cigarette ash, the same smell that clung to the envelopes. She pulled a player from the drawer and slid the cassette in. The tape hissed, then uncoiled into humming, low vowels, breath clicks, a cadence that matched the clinic recordings. Names lived inside it, tucked like notes in a seam. Slow the playback, and the syllables curved into Laura, Miriam, Jacob, ordinary names, folded by melody into the damp softness of sleep. She handed him a file bound with a rusty clip. Inside, intake forms, experiment logs, memos that dressed practice in clinical words, consensual comfort therapy, non-intrusive auditory cues. He read entries that stitched together a geometry of nights, dates matching photos, hummed names matching morning murmurs, patients waking with other people's syllables. One entry read: Subject 17, frequent nocturnal commitment, externalized vocalization. Reported, I tasted someone else's name. Another warned, carefully monitor reciprocity. Provision for transfer exists. The phrase provision for transfer felt like a hinge. He asked the nurse what transfer meant. She said names sometimes moved between people like currency, one sleeping mouth to another, pressed into the tissue of memory. We tried to trace sources, she said. Started with family names, then popular lists, then random names. The blank cassette was used when reciprocity was suspected. We labeled nothing, because those names belonged to others. He thought of receipts, the envelopes, the motel soap, the cigarette ash. The photos had arrived like proof. Small, cold, confirmation that a market of names moved beyond his sight. The clinic's ledger was a map. Its dates and names were arteries. She slid him a printed roster, folded as if apologetic. Columns: patient, date, hummed name, return. Most entries were crossed out. Some had X's. At the bottom, a scrawl matched his family name. The paper fell from his hand like a weight dropped. He left walking through wind that smelled of rain and metal. The city felt loud, the tape replaying beneath his skull. If names could be pressed into sleeping mouths and later summoned like bells, then there was method. Ledger, tape, staff hands humming into dark. He had a map now. He had a spool and dates. He began to trace names across the roster, drawing lines between dates and photographs, mapping where the humming had been played and who had listened. There were gaps. Nights with no patients, nights with charity cases, nights when the log simply read void. On some nights, multiple names circulated through different wards, returning to other faces as if shuffled cards were being passed. He wanted to know who was orchestrating the movement. The nurse suggested the founder, a sleep specialist who had since retired and lived in a house that always smelled faintly of boiled apples. When he found the house, the man was thin, the skin on his knuckles like parchment. He admitted to experiments with recorded humming, to trying anchoring techniques to steady REM. His hands trembled as he spoke. "We were trying to graft memory back," he said, "to give people names to hold when their own were gone." He asked about reciprocity. The founder's eyes went flat. "Names are social things," he said. "We discovered that when you hum a name into a ward, it will bloom elsewhere. The night takes what it can, and sometimes it gives back. Sometimes," the protagonist asked. "Sometimes it finds its way home," the founder said. "Or it finds another mouth that will carry it." The man spoke like a person reading a ledger. "We made lists, tried variables, measured return rates. It became less about comfort and more about transfer dynamics." He looked at the cassette in his hands, as if seeing it again might explain everything. "We were sloppy," he admitted. "We left doors open. Names walked off. People used them. We didn't foresee exchange." The language of lab notes shifted under his hands, from sterile to culpable. There were memos about consent that read like experiments, invoices for audio equipment, donations from foundations with polite names, and then a line item, provision fee, anonymized transfer service. The term sat in his throat. A document labeled reciprocity report summarized outcomes in plain decimals, percentages that made trade feel like accounting somewhere in those ledgers. A name had been entered, unremarkable, a string of characters that ended with his. He could not know who had first spoken it. But once on a roster, a name became a possibility. In the night he slept badly after that. When another envelope slid beneath his door, the paper smelled of detergent and cigarette smoke. Inside was a photo. A woman asleep on a sagging mattress, lips smudged in lipstick that spelled his name. He traced the letters with a finger that trembled. He thought of the founder's parchment hands, of the nurse's threadbare cuff, and of the ledger that had made his name legible to the night there. Was one more thing in the clinic files that would not leave him, a note scrawled in the margins, almost an afterthought. Noted. He woke with the metallic taste of fear on his tongue and a crumpled page under his palm. The apartment was too small for the way he felt, an animal pinned to a shape of light. And the clock on the nightstand blinked in different numbers. His throat worked. He tasted copper and alarm. On the page, in his own handwriting, a woman's name curved like a promise or a threat. The letters were steady, familiar. The loops and angles he'd unconsciously practiced as a child. He did not remember writing it. He swung his legs over the bed with the stiffness of someone emerging from water and walked to the kitchen for coffee, because there is an ordinary machinery to the morning that insists on functioning even during collapse. He turned on the kettle. Steam trembled against the window. The apartment smelled like the cassette had smelled, burned plastic, and something chemical and sweet that reminded him of motel soap. His hands shook as he thumbed open his phone. there in the camera roll, a new picture he did not take. Himself, sprawled on the couch the previous night, eyes slack, mouth parting. A pale face hovered at the edge of the frame, blurry, half-lit lips pressed to his own, until they left a smear of red that, when he leaned in close, spelled his name. A cold certainty slid through him. Thin and absolute, he backed against the counter and nearly fell. The world sharpened into small things. The ring of condensation on the table, the slight tear in the corner of the photograph he had tried to shred, the faint rustle of his neighbor's curtains. He called the sleep lab with hands that felt like gloves. His friend answered in the clipped, professional tone of someone who had spent too long listening to other people's nights. "Listen to me," he said, because the bones in his voice demanded an audience. His friend came over within an hour. Eyes red from interrupted sleep, they sat at his kitchen table, the whistle of the kettle like a distant train. They played the clinic recordings again, the same wavering whisper beneath the static, mapped with fingers across spectrograms. The spike reappeared, punctual and precise, right where each woman breathed his name. They listened until the light outside peeled from gray to white, and the day felt violated. Names travel in sleep. His friend said finally, the words arriving like a verdict. But who hums them? Who carries them? That's the question. He thought the answer had been the cassette, or the nurse, or the lullaby. He had burned the cassette and fed the smears of paper into a grinder. He had watched ash sift into the sink and thought watching ash fall was the same as watching the thing die. But the girl in the photo had been at his couch. Her mouth had been at his. If he had not taken the picture, who had? He scrolled through timestamps and metadata until the phone refused to give him more. There, between files, an image file with no origin. He tried to load it, and the phone stuttered, as if some small, deliberate weight was pressing on the circuitry. He began to barricade sleep. He stopped drinking caffeine only to take long walks until his feet ached. He wrapped his mouth with tape at night until his jaw throbbed. And he awoke with a mouth full of adhesive, and a day seamed with throbbing. He set cameras, cheap webcams, and his old phone aimed at the couch, at the bed, at the hallway. He kept a notebook open and vowed to write whatever he woke with. He swallowed melatonin, then eschewed it after nightmares. He tried everything that did not involve surrender. Each tactic felt like building a dam with hands that did not understand hydraulics. Resistance was humiliation. He slept anyway, because the body is faithful to its own calendar. The first time he watched himself on the footage, it was like watching someone else's grief. He lay on the couch, breath shallow, eyes slowly unfocusing. A shadow moved in the frame. A woman, pale with the garish wash of streetlight, bending close. Her lips brushed as the red appeared with the casual cruelty of a brand. He watched himself accept the intrusion, watched his chest rise and fall in sleep, watched the smear remain as if someone had impressed type into skin. footage corrupted at the edges with static, then calmed. He scrapped the camera and set a second. He slept again, and the same scene returned, each time a little sharper, as if the act were learning him. He stopped telling himself that this was only about images and objects. It was about the way names lived inside human bodies, like dust devils. He began to notice idle echoes in public places. A woman at the pharmacy humming to a child, and her syllables skittering against cans of beans. A bus driver's radio that caught sentences and spat them back as nonsense. Once, in a grocery store, he heard someone across the produce aisle murmur his name, as if rehearsing it in the palm of their mouth. He felt the warm pressure of a kiss he had never received. The name was not only on lips, it slid under doors. It nested in elevator joints. It traveled. He returned to the clinic, despite the way his chest hardened at the smell of antiseptic. The night nurse was a wrinkled presence with a smile that had been practiced for decades. She folded her hands like paper and admitted, with a soft cruelty, what she had always done when the lights were dim. A name hummed in the ward, a melody she borrowed from those who did not wake. It soothes them, she said. It keeps the nights from breaking. Her voice was small. Her eyes were careful. And the cassette? He asked. Who made it? She shrugged, as if she had been asked to explain the weather. Old patients put things in drawers, she said. People keep recordings. They give names sometimes. Names have weight. You know, Dotted was not consolation. It was a confession. He left with the old hallway light buzzing and the memory of faces in beds, mouths shaped into words they did not claim. He drove home with the radio off because he feared any noise might catch the cadence and send it scattering through the town like seed. He tried to trap the pattern in sound. He recorded his own voice, reciting every syllable of his name until his throat split and bled quiet sounds into the microphone. He played the recordings backward and forward and layered them until they became a tangled braid of vowels. He hummed at the edge of sleep and then woke to find he'd taught himself another voice, hers. His throat remembered the cadence of her breaths. He tasted something sweeter now when he woke, a sweetness like a coin in the mouth. One night fatigue folded him before he could decide to resist. He left a camera on a tripod and a bowl of water on the table. Superstitious, absurd. He slept. In the footage, the room grew thin around him. A woman entered like water through a sieve, not walking, but moving as if the floor inhaled. Her hair haloed her like smoke. She bent and kissed him as before. When she pulled away, the smear on his lips had changed. The red spelled not his name this time, but another, an old word he did not recognize, written in loops that were not his hand. He sat up in bed and laughed once, a short, brittle sound. He thought perhaps the thing was not done with him. Perhaps it collected names like a stamp collector, piling odd impressions until its book bulged. He met the woman in the photograph on purpose, The next week, he found her name in public records, then her address. She lived in a building that smelled of frying grease and old roses. When he knocked on the door, a man answered, sleep persecuted into someone else's face, and then no one. He slipped inside and moved through rooms like a ghost, because he no longer trusted the solid things of the world. The apartment was neat in a way that looked defensive. There were no photos on the walls, no lipstick stains on the rim of a glass. On the end table lay a small, framed print of a cassette tape, and beneath it, in pencil, a line of names penned like inventory. He did not expect confrontation. He expected answers, or at least the brittle comfort of being able to place the phenomenon inside some human hand. Instead, he found evidence of exchange, lists and garbled recordings and notes that read like the minutes of an obsession. The woman, he found her later at a laundromat, asleep in a chair with a cigarette smoldering between two fingers. He watched her as she dozed and woke and kissed a friend goodbye. She did not look like a vessel. She looked like someone whose sleep had been negotiated by others. When he finally asked her about the photographs, she looked at him with a tenderness that made him sick and said nothing, because she did not understand the grammar of the thing. She slept with other names on her lips too, she said at last, vague and certain, all at once. Sometimes she woke with words stitched into her clothing. Sometimes strangers left photographs in her mailbox, and she assumed them gifts. She thought the world was simply a strange place where small cruelties happened, and people made odd trades. It was a revelation and a condemnation. The names moved in both directions. He had burned paper and plastic, but not the pattern. He had tried to exorcise a sound by incinerating its carrier, but the thing was not an object. It was rhythm lodged in syllables, and syllables lived inside living mouths. It propagated like a myth. It sought air. He began to hear his own voice at odd moments, echoing a syllable that was not his. The woman's name, soft and present. He found he could say it without thinking, and sometimes without meaning. It hummed under his breath while he read, while he rinsed a dish, while he lay awake mapping the ceiling for entrances. The more he said it, the more the town learned it, and his name, his actual name, started to appear on other lips in the most mundane ways. A cashier would touch a receipt and look at him with a start, and then with a strange, private smile. A subway rider would whisper his name, and then clench their fists as if recalling something private. It became an exchange currency. Without a mint, he thought perhaps someday it would stop. He thought if he could find the origin, who first hummed the rhythm, he could unweave it. He thought he might be able to return names, but there is no beginning in these things. There are only edits. Names swap like cards across a table, hands never fully visible. For every name he returned, his own repeated itself on a mouth he had never seen. The woman's name lived in his mouth, now as if it had always been lodged there. When he slept, he tasted her, and when he awoke, she had a smear of a syllable on her lips. They were both carriers, and carriers were contagious. On the last night, he let himself fall without instrument or protection. He lay down on the couch as the rain came, a patient tapping at glass, and let exhaustion gather him. He did not set a camera. He did not tape his mouth. He wanted the unvarnished answer. He wanted to know whether surrender would end or amplify. He dreamt of a corridor lined with doors. Behind each door, a mouth moved. He saw the nurse humming, a cassette spool unwinding into the dark like a snake. He saw his own signature curl into another's name and then dissolve. He felt, suddenly, and with a clarity so cruel it was almost comic, that the act of carrying names was not malicious, it was necessary. It was the system of breath and rumor and consolation. It was barter. People gave their nights so other people could sleep. He woke with the sun a pale coin and the taste of sweetness in his mouth. He touched his lips, expecting reflex and paper and ash. Instead, he found a smear of color, a mark soft as a bruise, and a small, trembling note folded under his palm. The note read simply, in a handwriting that could have been his, or could have been 100 other hands. She sleeps with his name on her lips. He read it 3 times, and then, because habit is a stubborn animal, he mouthed the word that had been in his mouth so often it had become part of his diction. The woman's name came out like breath outside, in the stairwell, and across the street, and in the hush of morning. Other mouths shaped it too. He stepped into the light and felt the city rearrange itself around an old rhythm. He was no longer merely pursued, he was a participant. He carried her name, and she carried his, and everyone else moved names like stones down a river. He understood then that there was no final reclaiming, no neat extinguishment. There was only exchange, and the exchange never stopped. He folded the note and slid it into his pocket like contraband. He ran his tongue along a tooth and tasted the woman, the nurse, the cassette, the taxi driver's radio that kept catching a syllable and throwing it back. He breathed in, and the taste stayed. He would go on carrying her. He would wake to find other letters planted in skin he recognized as his. He would sometimes be the giver, sometimes the recipient. Names would travel through him. They would travel from mouth to mouth until the town was a ledger of borrowed syllables. If you want to hear how this story ends, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with the time you listen.